All right, we are live. We are continuing the Cooperation Tulsa Organizer Education Sessions. This time, we are beginning on Volume 2 of Full Spectrum Resistance. So I am going to link this around just a little bit so that we can get some viewers in here. But for anybody who has not read Volume 1, I just want to remind anybody watching that you can go over to either the lives for the Anark YouTube or the lives for the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube, and both of them have all of our reading sessions for Volume 1 of Full Spectrum Resistance. And I just want to note that this, if for anybody who's not familiar, our reading groups, we read out loud. We don't like read in private and then come and discuss. So these are not just discussion groups. These are actually reading groups. So you can go find a complete read through of Volume 1 of Full Spectrum Resistance on either the Anark channel or on the Cooperation Tulsa channel. All right, I am doing stuff, getting closer, almost here. There we go. All right. So for anybody who's not familiar, what you do is we just type 1, 2, 3, 4 in order in chat, and that just determines the reading order. So I typed 1, that means I go first. Who's going second? We got Zan, who's going third? And who's going fourth? I guess that would just be Gabe, naturally. There we go. All right. So just to catch everybody up, we have already done a full read through of Volume 1 of Full Spectrum Resistance. Full Spectrum Resistance Volume 1 was kind of like just like a big overview of the history of not only revolutionary movements, but just like even like pressure campaigns, like just movements for change, really. And just like looking at the big overarching aspects of what leads to social change. And this one gets more into the nitty gritty. There's a lot more about like the sort of mechanics of how to manage an organization. And we, as I was saying to people before we started the live stream, like this, we had actually done a full read through of Volume 1 and part of Volume 2 before we began doing the live streams of our organizer education group. And this one is very rich. There's a lot of good detail in here, and I think we kind of realized that people were missing out on like these as a resource, and that's part of what motivated us to do the live streaming, because Volume 2 really has just as much meat, I think, as Volume 1 did. And so we're happy to almost be caught up to where we were before we began recording everything on live streams. So yeah, give me just a moment. I'll get this pulled up so people can see it on the screen. There we go. Let's get this out of the way. Okay, I think we're looking good now. I think people can see it on the live stream. And I'm going to click through to the live stream just to make sure that everybody can hear my voice on the live stream and everything's good. It actually looks like I might have made a good decision in checking that, because I don't know if it's going through. I wonder if somebody else can click through and try to listen. You hear me on the live stream? Can you hear me? You can hear me on the live stream? For some reason, I cannot hear. I just brought myself up and I cannot hear myself on the live stream. I'm not sure what that's about. Okay. But people in the live stream are giving me comments saying they can hear me. Okay. And I just want, let's also do now a test from people in the chat. Can I get one of you to say something to see if we can hear y'all on live stream?
Testing 1, 2. Can you all hear me?
Testing 3, 4.
So just if somebody here in chat, looks like we have 8 people in chat. If somebody can just tell us. Okay, also thumbs up there. Cool. Looks like we are ready to go. All right. So, just for those of you, I think everybody, perhaps Chris has been here at a previous reading group. So, just the general precept is that everybody reads about 1 to 2 pages. I think 2 pages is our normal amount. So you just read like 2 pages and you say next. And we just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 until we've read for about an hour. Or to be more specific, we're going to stop at about 8:30 CDT, and then we're going to spend the last 30 minutes discussing what it was that we read through. So that's how we do it. I'm going to just get us started here at the beginning. Oh, there we go. All right. Okay, so this is actually good. It gives a recap of Volume 1. I was going to say we were going to do a recap of Volume 1, but this does it for us. So recap of Volume: Building Movements and Fighting to Win. Welcome to Volume 2 of Full Spectrum Resistance. The first volume began by exploring why we need resistance movements, what makes them effective, and how they win. To recap, we live in a world racked by serious crises of human rights, justice, and ecology, but the traditional left and progressive movements have been whittled down to a few ineffective tactics. We need a resistance movement if we want to achieve any lasting justice and to save our planet. Much of the left has forgotten, mythologized, or sanitized social movements of the past and does not understand how those struggles were actually won. Movements win by developing political force, by developing cultures of resistance, and by taking action. Conversely, those in power rule by divide and conquer. To succeed, resistance movements must build shared understanding and solidarity and employ diverse tactics while reaching across divides to build powerful movements that can use disruption and militancy. In Full Spectrum Resistance, I show how resistance movements form and organize in practical terms, and effective resistance movements are more alike than they are different. From the Montgomery bus boycott to anti-colonial insurgencies, all movements need to develop critical capacities like recruitment, intelligence, and strategy. In the first volume, we touched on dozens of stories and movements, from the Black Panthers to indigenous blockaders, from anti-apartheid struggles to ACT UP. And in different chapters, we explored 3 of those critical movement capacities. So the first bold heading here is recruitment and training. Resistance movements are made out of people. To win, they must constantly recruit new people while strengthening communities of resistance and developing the skills of existing members. Groups and second bold heading says groups and organization. There is no one right way to organize, but a group structure must match their strategy. The most effective movements aren't militant or well organized, but militant and organized. I see. The most effective movements aren't militant or well organized, but militant and organized. There we go. The third bold heading is security and safety. Resistance movements are a threat to power and must consciously protect themselves from external repression and infiltration. They also have to keep their members safe from internally damaging or disruptive people. History shows us many tools for accomplishing this, and also demonstrates what happens when we fail to use those tools properly. In the second volume of Full Spectrum Resistance, we'll explore more stories of successful resistance and learn from movements around the world. How did a group of Greek anarchists take over a television station during a period of countrywide upheaval? How did a blind teenager build one of the most powerful resistance movements in Nazi-occupied France? How did liberation movements in Vietnam defeat far wealthier and more powerful invaders? And how did a small group of indigenous women bring a decisive end to an unwanted garbage dump that a community fought against for decades? Next.
We'll use those and other stories to investigate the critical capacities that successful movements must build. How they communicate with supporters and each other, Chapter 7. How they gather the intelligence they need to beat bigger opponents, Chapter 8. How they understand and resist the systems of counterintelligence and repression that those in power will use to try to crush effective movements, Chapter 9. and how groups and organizations raise money and supply themselves for the long fight, chapter 10. Finally, we'll bring together every key idea and theme in this book to understand how movements take effective action, chapter 11, and how they combine these key capacities and build the strategies and campaigns that allow them to win, chapter 12. If you need a refresher on key terms or ideas from this book, check out the glossary at the end of the volume. For bonus content, go to fullspectrumresistance.org. Chapter 7, Communications. There's a quote from Saul Alinsky. One can lack any of the qualities of an organizer, with one exception, and still be effective and successful. That exception is the art of communication. It does not matter what you know about anything if you cannot communicate to your people. In that event, you are not even a failure, you're just not there. The next quote is by Malcolm X. If you're not careful, the newspaper will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Greek television takeover. It's December 2008. In Greece, a revolt is underway. Economic collapse and government austerity have fueled rising political agitation and radical organizing. But it is the police murder of a 15-year-old named Alexis that triggers an uprising. His death is the match that ignites fuel accumulated over decades of political action and repression. Next.
Gabe, that's you, I believe. Or wait, let me check.
I'm sorry. No, it's me.
No, it's you. Okay.
First, there are protests and a few major riots around the country. Then, anarchists, radical leftists, and anti-authoritarians take over schools and squares. In some places, police stations and government buildings are attacked. Capitalism is a target as hundreds of luxury stores are destroyed. The occupied schools and government buildings become social and political hubs for distributing radical information. But the media is still dominated by the propaganda of the government and the capitalists who caused the economic crisis in the first place. So Greek resistors decide to stage a takeover of a national television station so they can bring their message directly to a mass audience. A group of artists, actors, documentarians, and anarchists spend a week in a basement planning the action. They decide to take over the 3 o'clock news, prime time in a country where most people take a mid-afternoon break. I'm sorry, I lost your screen, Daniel. Okay, there we go. Can you scroll up there? They make huge maps of the station building and memorize them. Sympathetic insiders from the television industry work with them to prepare. They split the group into 3 teams to target the control room and studio, the master signal room, and the office of the station president. Each target is on a different floor, but must be reached at exactly the right time to ensure the takeover. I'm sorry, I lost your screen again, Daniel. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So you can't see my screen right now?
No, it says video for Daniel's screen has been turned off to save.
Oh, that's weird.
I can take over. I can see your screen.
Well, we got to fix it. It's okay. It's like, okay, maybe it's the browser I've opened it in. Give me just a second. I'm going to fix this. Okay, maybe
Maybe
it's
on my end.
well, no, I think Zan just said that they're having the same problem. So, let's just X that off. We're going to start from scratch. Open in a different program. Perhaps that was the problem. Caliber ebook viewer, perhaps. And I'll just have to find our place again. I don't remember what page we were on, but I don't think it'll take too long.
11.
11. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm opening it in a committed ebook viewer, so maybe that'll make a difference. Oh, it is being pretty weird right now, actually. This is being very weird. I'm gonna try this again. Different viewer again. Let's see, what do we got? Open with. Okay. I don't know if that's gonna work. I hope it does. Let's find out. Okay, we're gonna go here. Stop screen sharing, start screen sharing. We're gonna go that, share. Tell me if you can see it now.
I can.
Okay, good. Let's see if we got this.
It's still turned off to save bandwidth for me.
What the heck? That is very odd. I don't know how to fix that.
I can see it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to do that on YouTube. So maybe Chris and I, we follow from our own PDF, open in another window this time.
Perhaps. I'm just going to try to get us back to where we were. Why is it not showing? 11 is where we were at, the end of 11, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So that's where we.
Somewhere in here, I think it was. I remember make huge maps.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah. There we go. They split the group into 3 teams to target the control room and studio, the master signal room, and the office of the station president. Each target is on a different floor, but must be reached at exactly the right time to ensure the takeover. They rehearse the plan until they have memorized every corner of the map. They time each step to the second. The action happens on Tuesday, December 16th. To bypass security at the main door and avoid raising suspicions, they sneak people in through the side door, a few at a time, over 2 hours, until all 50 activists are inside. They dress the part in suits and formal clothing. Each person carries a prop for their cover story, like a file folder or a handful of mail. They enter the target rooms at the appropriate time. In the master signal room, they call out instructions. In the control room, they take over the seats of the corporate control staff. They act as friendly as possible and reassure the staff they will only be there a few minutes. When the Prime Minister is in the middle of a live speech from the Parliament, they switch the video feed to the occupied studio. Those in the studio hold up enormous banners. Don't just watch us. Everyone, get out in the streets, one reads. Another says, freedom to the prisoners of the insurrection, while a third adds, freedom to everyone. They stay on air sorry. They stay on air for a couple of minutes before another control room, which which they don't know about, cuts off the signal. I'm going to hand it off because I keep on fading out. Next.
They stay on the air for a couple of minutes before another control room, which they didn't know about, cuts off the signal. They thank the employees and politely begin their escape, taking the stairs rather than the elevators, so they can't be tracked. They rendezvous at ground level and leave the building as a group. As they leave, they encounter police, but the police do not try to arrest the departing activists. In a time when insurgents are attacking police stations directly, the cops are relieved to see an action that is not violent, and so the successful radicals leave unimpeded. Without communication, there can be no resistance. Communication is what allows isolated dissidents to join up, understand their situation, and plan for action. It is what allows a resistance group to break its isolation to become part of a movement rooted in larger society. Resistors need to communicate to strategize, analyze, mobilize, and act, especially under repressive surveillance states. Good communication is a prerequisite to successful recruiting, fundraising, and movement building in general. And conversely, it is the corporate media and other official channels of communication that allow the government to control the popular narrative and imagination, to smear or deceive resistors, to divide dissidents against each other, even to obscure or erase struggles for justice from collective memory. So it's no surprise, with so much at stake, that effective resistors fight to reach out and communicate. Rarely is that as dramatic as the takeover of a TV station in the middle of a parliamentary broadcast. Communication through less fantastic methods, giving interviews, making websites, and sharing pamphlets is no less important. Effective communication doesn't have to be a spectacle, and the drive to make it a spectacle can be a trap the mass media use to distort movement. I'm not going to tell you here how to make a zine or write a press release. Those practicalities are handled in more detail elsewhere. I'm going to address bigger questions that are discussed less often. How do resistance movements communicate externally to reach sympathizers and supporters? How do they deal with the power and contradictions of the mass media? How do they communicate internally to build a shared culture and organize action? How do they maintain safe communication, especially in underground groups when dealing with repressive states and pervasive surveillance? Joe Freeman, who wrote about the tyranny of structurelessness, argued that resistance movements need a specific kind of communications network. Masses alone don't form movements, however discontented they may be. Small informal groups may form spontaneously, she explains, but if they are not linked in some manner, the protest does not become generalized. It remains a local irritant or dissolves completely. If a movement is to spread rapidly, the communications network must already exist. The existence of a friendly communication network determines how and how quickly a movement will be able to grow and develop. And that form of that communication network may determine the form of the movement. Communication and organization go hand in hand. According to Freeman, the women's movement and the 1960s and 70s could be divided into two branches, a well-established liberal, quote, reform branch, and a newer, quote, radical branch. The reform branch was formally organized with boards and bylaws, while the radical branch consisted of small groups with few intergroup connections. The newer branch, she wrote, prides itself on its lack of organization. From its radical roots, it inherited the idea that structures were always conservative and confining, and leaders isolated and elitist, thus eschewing structure and damning the idea of leadership. It has carried the concept of everyone doing her own thing to the point where communication is haphazard and coordination is almost non-existent. Thousands of sister chapters around the country are virtually independent of each other, linked only by numerous underground papers, journals, newsletters, and cross-country travelers. Next.
Freeman explains, quote, "The different structures have largely determined the structure or the strategy of the two branches, irrespective of any conscious intentions of the participants," end quote. Or to put it another way, strategy follows structure. That's not necessarily bad, assuming the different parts of the movement can work together. As Freeman notes, quote, Intra-movement differences are often perceived by the participants as conflicting, but it is their essential complementarity which has been one of the strengths of the movement, end quote. Freeman argues that in the 1960s, a series of crises mobilized feminists, and organizing efforts were able to, quote, weld spontaneous groups together into a movement, end quote. But she warns, this wouldn't have happened without a pre-existing communications network that was amenable to feminist ideas. Those lessons apply to any movement that wants to win. A communications network must be built or an existing one repurposed. Otherwise, groups will remain fragmented and isolated. And something must happen to trigger larger action. Freeman notes that, quote, a crisis will only catalyze a well-formed communications network, end quote. If that communications network isn't there, then crises will pass and opportunities for real change will be missed. Freeman argues that, quote, people must be organized. Social movements do not simply occur. If a movement, or that, end quote, if a movement is unable or unwilling to build its own communications channels, especially to those outside the movement, then someone else may take on that role. The mass media will have a communication monopoly and depict that movement in a way that suits its own purposes. Bold heading, resistance and the mass media. Quote, there is no such thing at this stage of the world's history in America as an independent press, end quote, said New York Times journalist and chief editorial writer John Swinton upon winning an award from his peers. Quote, there's not one of you who dare to write your honest opinions, and if you did, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print, end quote. And he laughed at the idea of an independent press. The owners of the papers are in charge, not the editors. Quote, we're the jumping jacks, they pull the strings, and we dance, end quote. That was in 1880. Corporate control has only gotten stronger. If you've tried to get press coverage for radical action before, you already know this. The news isn't made by intrepid individual reporters and editors driven by the drive to spread the truth. It's made by a media industrial complex, mostly owned and controlled by a handful of companies. Those companies compete for public attention and advertising dollars. Despite the perpetual assertion by conservative pundits that the media has a left-wing bias, this corporate ownership structure produces precisely the opposite. As Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky pointed out in their classic book, Manufacturing Consent, only the wealthy and their companies can afford to own large and expensive media infrastructure on a mass scale. Those who own huge printing presses, sprawling television studios, and satellite distribution networks are already wealthy, and they have the attitudes of the affluent class. That doesn't mean that all news media are the same, or that there aren't individual people who want genuinely good and fair news, or that the rise of the internet hasn't complicated the situation. Individual reporters are sometimes very friendly to dissidents. But the structural bias of the mass media is against radicals and revolutionaries. This doesn't take a degree in media studies to grasp. Radical activists figure it out for themselves when they are smeared or ignored in the media. Next. Who's supposed to be next? Number 2. Zan. Yeah, Zan, are you here? I think Zan stepped out. So then next would be Chris.
Yeah. For those reasons, many radicals have become deeply cynical or even antagonistic towards the media, to the point of refusing to engage with them in any way. In 2002, I joined an anti-poverty march to set up a protest squad. Organizers seized an abandoned building, and the rest of us set up camp in a perimeter around the building to protect them. After night fell, a TV crew arrived and started asking if anyone wanted to do an interview. A group of punks started yelling curses and insults at the TV crew. After a few minutes of this, the TV crew left, shouting that we would be on our own if the police decided to raid and beat us all up. In another city, at a public rally in front of a courthouse, I saw some people trying to spray paint the camera lens of a different TV crew, apparently out of spite. I can understand, especially given the media's claims to inform and enlighten why people get angry when the mass media lie, ignore, or hide the truth. I get angry too, and I can respect if individuals or groups choose not to engage with the corporate media. As individuals, we can make those choices, but that's not an option for movements. Obscurity can be comfortable, especially if the press is already biased against your radical politics. But for above ground movements, obscurity is fatal. Militant suffragists like the Pankhursts knew this, which is why they escalated to civil disobedience and property destruction. Trevor Lloyd writes, quote, "Sympathy was worth having, but it was not enough. The Pankhursts knew that to make progress, they had to arouse public opinion and make people interested in the question. They may have realized that this would arouse hostility, but hostility was more useful than indifference." Close quote. Those in power don't have to like us, nor do the majority of people have to love us, but they can't ignore us if we are going to win. Our worst enemy is apathy. In a movement that has any impact on the power structure, it will get covered in the mass media, whether it wants to or not. The effects of that mass media coverage are profound. They will alter the structure and tactics of the movement. And let's be clear, the mass media have been essential to the success of many social movements and resistance movements in history. If footage of the Freedom Rides had not made the evening news so consistently, popular sentiment may not have turned against the segregation the way it did, and the Freedom Rides may have ended up in an obscure defeat and with many more casualties. But measuring success by mass media coverage is dangerous. It allows the press to set the agenda. It twists and distorts movements in predictable ways. Julie Boykoff writes, quote, "Mass media coverage, or lack thereof, influences the nature, form, and development of social movements, as well as the ability of these movements to reach their goals. Understanding the role of the mass media is crucial to apprehending how social movements coalesce, build, and maintain themselves, as well as how they decide to frame their dissident messages." Closed quote. Next.
If we want to be successful resistors, it's not enough just to despise the corporate media. We need some understanding of how they work, how they alter movements, when they can be used effectively, and how we can avoid their traps. If we understand those things, then we can decide for ourselves when and how we want to engage with them, and when it is better to use and develop our own channels of communication. How the mass media depict and distort resistance movements. Scholars and analysts have identified recurring patterns in the way that news is created and framed. I'll use examples mostly from US media here, partly to develop a coherent picture and partly because of the dominance of US media companies. But these patterns occur around the world. Depiction of resistance movements is driven by a number of factors. Big bold. Sensationalization, dramatization, and novelty seeking. Even if they are sympathetic to a resistance movement, media corporations are competing for audience attention. They get attention by emphasizing the most sensationalist, spectacular, or novel aspects of any story. They zero in on aspects of a social movement that appear most exciting or controversial, usually at the expense of converting underlying issues or grievances. Big bold. Framing, marginalization, and trivialization. Paradoxically, Although the mass media want new images and events, they also want to frame that material in a way that is familiar, even formulaic for the audience. Frames are news shortcuts, journalistic cliches, story stereotypes. William Gamson and Andre Modigliani write that a frame is, quote, a central organizing idea or storyline that provides meaning to an unfolding strip of events, weaving a connection among them. The frame suggests what controversy is about, the essence of the issue. End quote. This is not always meant to be deceptive. It's a function of how news works. A typical book might be 100,000 words long. A typical newspaper article is 1,000 words or fewer. The narration of a typical television news story comprises fewer than 100 words. That leaves very little room for thoughtful context, nuance, or subtlety. And thoughtfulness doesn't make for a good spectacle. Frames allow journalists to simplify or oversimplify a complex issue by presenting it in a set formula from the headlines on. They pick and choose their facts or quotes, selecting those that fit their frame and ignoring those that don't. News reporting, a protest against an international summit like the G20, will usually ignore issues of global inequity and focus on more sensational frames. Consider the violence frame, in which reporters ignore root issues in order to obsess about whether there will be, quote, violence, and how police are preparing for it. A typical headline with this framing might read, quote, police warn violent protesters in advance of summit, end quote, or more indirectly, quote, hospitals prepare for G20 casualties, end quote. This framing begins in advance of a protest date. It is less about actual events than about setting expectations. The disruption frame also regards the issue to focus on stories about how, quote, regular people, end quote, are disrupted. Typical headlines might read, quote, G20 turning downtown Toronto into a ghost town, or city on lockdown, end quote, or small businesses press government for compensation, end quote. Next.
I think that's me. Yeah, Zan's been coming in and out, so I think it's going to be me here. Another frame centers on protesters', quote, absurd ineffectuality. Yet another is the freak frame, which again ignores issues and emphasizes protesters' appearance or clothing and marginalizes activists by, quote, showing demonstrators to be deviant or unrepresentative, as Todd Gitlin puts it. One damaging frame emphasizes internal conflict, the, quote, good protesters versus the, quote, bad protesters. Frames don't have to be explicitly stated, and usually aren't. Rather, they are invoked by the use of specific words and phrases, images, and the structure and emphasis of news coverage. Media frames consistently reinforce existing biases and prejudice. Remember that after the Katrina disaster in New Orleans, Black people were depicted as looting stores, while white people doing the same thing were finding supplies. Framing has major effects on how resistance movements are perceived and how well they're able to mobilize support. Environmental campaigner Chris Rose argues that such frames, quote, not only make everything sound familiar, but also, when added together, suggest that problems are either insoluble or certainly out of reach for ordinary people, end quote. Because the same set of frames is constantly used, the implicit statement is that the outcome too will repeat and that nothing can ever change. Damn, that's a really good insight. A media obsession with violence framing also serves as a way of intimidating people who might consider attending protests. Media framing can shift who shows up for an event and the sorts of recruits available for social movements. Sarah Falconer warns that this tendency to oversimplify has worsened in recent years as online news sources rush to be first, even if their reports are simplistic, misinformed, or simple hoaxes. We've seen not only the rise of exaggerated clickbait stories, but also simply fake news. If individual corporate journalists deviate from the desired framing and sensationalism, they will either be drowned out by the mass media cacophony or forced to fall in line by their superiors. Bold heading: false balance and deference to authority. Though the mass media claims to be objective, it often uses false balance to undermine social movements and progressives. For example, an anti-war protest with 100,000 might be treated as equal in relevance to a counter-protest with 1,000 attendees, when it is obviously not. I'm just going to maybe just read the rest of this page. No, we'll hand off. We've still got like 3 minutes. I'll just finish this paragraph and then we'll hand off. In the global warming quote unquote debate in the mass media, thousands of actual climate scientists are given equal time to right-wing talking heads with no credentials in climate science whatsoever. The implicit assumption is that the two arguments have equal weight and that the truth lies somewhere in between. Next.
False balance isn't just about giving airtime to reactionaries, but about comparing liberatory radicals with so-called quote unquote equivalent extremists on the other side. So the Deacons for Defense or the American Indian Movement could be framed as extremist and just as COINTELPRO wanted as radical hate groups akin to the KKK. Never mind that one side was trying to prevent lynchings while the other was trying to commit them. This phony objectivity also shows in quote sources. A news article about a group opposed to the G20 gathering will almost always include quote unquote official quotes, undermining the dissident message and reinforcing the dominant talking points. This is included for reasons of quote unquote balance. But the reverse is unlikely. When official statements are made about a meeting or a government policy, it's rare for reporters to get a balancing quote from someone outside of the political establishment. In any case, authority always gets the last word. Bold header, disregard and undercounting. In an extension of authority, getting the last word, protest attendance is routinely undercounted with quote unquote official police counts used over third-party tallies or counts by protest organizers. This has been documented in anti-war protests from Vietnam to Iraq. Sometimes massive protests are simply ignored by the media. This undermines the ability of social movements to succeed using nonviolence and makes it easier for police to crack down on protesters. This disregard makes it especially important for movements to have their own means of communication, and some movements would have withered without it. During the civil rights sit-ins, organizers relied on direct contact to share information and support each other, since local media might refuse to cover civil rights actions. Bold header, demonization. Framing dissidents as freaks is one option. If that doesn't work, the next step is to frame them as dangerous, either by equating them with criminal element or with some other enemy. Framing resistors as criminal is a classic and often effective tactic because it delegitimizes resistance struggles and makes the public accept the use of police violence and imprisonment. After all, what's police to do? What police do to the bad guys, right? Almost every time there's a large-scale protest against war or against a summit, the media obligingly stoke fears of mob violence while airing police press conferences with tables of seized weapons like books, water bottles, or cigarette lighters. One of the most effective ways of demonizing domestic political groups is to associate them in the media with some foreign enemy, what Jules Boykoff calls the quote unquote bi-level demonization. He explains, quote, once an individual or group has been demonized through linkage to an external enemy, further suppression can occur with fewer objections from the general population, close quote. This is an old trick for the state. Around the time of World War I, the Wobblies and other radicals had made significant gains, so that the state claimed that they were associated with the quote unquote German menace. Members were arrested, and the state and media made vague claims about German money funding a labor conspiracy meant to undermine American industry through strikes in order to weaken the war effort. At the same time, the government shut down many radical publications claiming that their pro-peace stance was, quote unquote, treasonous. Concrete evidence was not required. The goal was to disparage the moral character of labor radicals while justifying repression against them. In Canada during World War I and World War II, large numbers of labor organizers and other radicals were interned in prison camps because of ancestry in quote unquote enemy European countries. After World War II and the defeat of Germany, the era of McCarthyism brought a new foreign enemy, the USSR. And so, communism became an excuse to crack down, smear, or blacklist domestic radicals. When the United States invaded Vietnam, the state and media propaganda shifted its focus. The media emphasized the presence of Vietnamese flags in peace marches as a sign that anti-war protesters were traitors in league with foreign enemies. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, communism has been replaced by terrorism as the main quote unquote enemy for use in bi-level demonization, especially since 9/11. Terrorism has proven an incredibly effective means of demonizing enemies. Without a clear and concrete enemy and without any limits or end date, the quote unquote war on terror, the smear of terrorism can be used widely against almost any internal enemy. The breadth of application is remarkable. Boykoff quotes a statement from the California Anti-Terrorism Information Center. Quote, you can almost argue that a protest against a war ostensibly against international terrorism is a terrorist act, said a spokesman. I've heard of terrorism described as anything that is violent or has an economic impact, and shutting down a port certainly would have some impact. Terrorism isn't just bombs going off and killing people, close quote. The specter of terrorism has been invoked against everything from anti-war movements to indigenous groups to immigrant movements. It's especially useful in the Green Scare against the Earth Liberation Front, the Animal Liberation Front, and Stop Huntington's Animal Cruelty. Do we want to stop there?
Yep, seems like a perfect place for us to stop the reading portion of the reading group. So we have about 30 minutes left. We go till about 9. It's currently 8:35. So this is the portion where we open the floor to discussion. Just if anybody, what I usually like to do here is just kind of immediately ask, does anything pop out to anybody as being like particularly noteworthy that you think deserves some discussion?
I think just the reminder that kind of receiving media support is essential to movement effectiveness. That, you know, the fact that the media is kind of stacked against change doesn't mean that movements should abandon efforts to attract media.
Yeah, I also think that's a big takeaway from what he's saying here. He's basically, I like that he's very reasonable in this text, just eminently reasonable on every topic. And one thing he notes here, he's like, there's a lot of good reasons for us to be upset with the media, right? Like it's not as if he's not discounting all of the criticisms. There's lots of good criticisms. But he's pointing out where it's like, yeah, but pretty much every movement that's had any success has been one that somehow has embedded itself into the discussions of the mainstream media. And I have to be honest, I can't think of any exceptions to that. I can't think of a single counterexample. So, yeah, for me, I think one thing that really stood out was I liked this part where he pointed out that the repetitive use of framing is not only a way to kind of get everybody stuck in a particular set of responses, but I think the part that really stood out to me is where he said, because the same set of frames is constantly used, the implicit statement is that the outcome too will repeat and that nothing can ever change. And I just think that is just such a profoundly good insight. Like, I think that is exactly what it's all about. It's also kind of like, you know, you like, there's like all these movies where we have like a revolutionary get introduced. And then every single time the revolutionary gets introduced, the revolutionary carries out terrible excesses of violence and cruelty and goes overboard. And that's what happens every single time. We never get a revolutionary that like carries out a revolution and it's a good thing, right? The revolutionary is always the bad guy. And so like, they've essentially created a set of narratives where it can only proceed over this set of narratives, and by controlling the form of those narratives, they make us think like we're locked into the end of history, essentially. Yappa Brew in the chat actually points out something towards Chris's point here. He said, reminds me how well the students protesting the genocide were media trained and using the media interactions as an opportunity to spread the movement. He also says, also note working with different groups that work to the same end, I suppose is probably what you mean here. Having those communication channels open sounds a lot like communication prefiguration. And yeah, I would agree. I think that's a good point. Any other thoughts that came to mind while we were reading through this?
I mean, it's an entirely different time now. Like, we've got so much media, and like, we can create our own social media and kind of like build media ourselves. So I feel like it's the last thing but doomed to repeat, which is comforting.
I hear what you're saying, and I agree that it's a very different environment. I would say one of the challenges with that is it's a much more fractured environment, and so kind of the ability to get attention by a large number of people is more challenging and more concentrated in the hands of just a few individuals. And so, like, you know, the ability through X to promote through the algorithm a narrative is something that's really powerful.
You know, it's interesting because like I got my start in Occupy, and in Occupy, we were like so conscious about how everything we were doing was going to like play into the spectacle and how the media was going to respond, how we we're going to use the media's response. And it's interesting that it seems like there's a lot less of a structured approach to the media being used today. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's, you know, there's the ups and downs that he discusses in this section. But I wonder if like it would be good for Cooperation Tulsa to like create like a press release just telling people about Flat Rock, for example. Maybe that would just be a good idea. And then we just give the press release to like every station in Tulsa or whatever, and then use that as a way to get attention to Cooperation Tulsa, because we don't really sacrifice much in that process. It's not like we're not compromising our ethics in the process. Also, if anybody just has any other thoughts about the text, feel free to just kind of present those thoughts, and then we can expand on that.
Well, what you just said, I'm wondering if like different kinds of press release could be helpful, like emphasizing specific, like if we take Corporation Tulsa specifically, like emphasizing specific aspects of what y'all doing for the mainstream media, and then other aspects for more kind of smaller or leftist publication or online magazines or something that could help spread the message wider, but not you don't compromise on your mission, but you also cater the message to the different outlets.
Anybody else have anything that stuck out to them in the text?
Well, I think just kind of the recurring theme of false equivalence and how the media, from kind of a sense of journalistic objectivity, will feel a compulsion to present equal points, even if the material differences are significant.
Yeah, and we see that all the time, right? Like there's like 100 memes that have been created trying to demonstrate this, where it's like the guy that's like on one side you have like the leftists, and then on the right side you have like a bunch of KKK members. Like the leftists or like the KKK members are like, "I want to lynch you," and on the other side it's like, "We don't want people to be lynched." And then you have like the centrist in the middle, like, "I can't tell the difference between these two guys." Like, that's just what the media does by default, it seems like.
Yeah, it truly amazes me that I was born into this world every day.
Yep. Yeah, I one part here that stood out to me was this, where he's discussing the freak frame. So like it's interesting because this is like a big part of what they did with Occupy, like Occupy at first was like, it started as being the good protesters, quote unquote. But then as there began to be a sensation that they were actually being effective, the narrative just totally shifted. And then every time that there was any story, it was the freak frame. Then it became all about their absurd ineffectuality, as he puts it here. Even though the reason why they started saying that was because Occupy was beginning to be effective, it was starting to scare people in power. And so they started to portray occupiers as being freaks, and they started to try to interview every person who was dressed silly, every person who was in a costume, every person who was like a kook who was just saying absurd stuff, right? Like as how he says here, it ignores the issues and emphasizes the protesters' appearance or clothing, and it marginalizes activists by showing demonstrators to be deviant or unrepresentative. And I think here he means unrepresentative of the population. And so like the idea is, it's like you're trying to portray these as being like, these aren't people like you. These are fucking weirdos who are camping in a park. Like, and that was highly effective. That was highly effective against Occupy.
Well, and I kind of am torn on that as to whether movements should actually just kind of lean into that framing. And I mean, I think about with Cooperation Tulsa and, you know, it being framed as an anarchist organization. And I know that that's not a term that's frequently used in association with it, but whether that's something that could be powerful precisely because it's a little edgy and a little scary to people. And, you know, I think in terms of getting attention and stimulating discussion, you know, being a little scary is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I think that if they were to transition from Cooperation Tulsa being like quote unquote the good protesters to that, that would be the transition to what he's calling demonization. So like, let's see here, where is it? Disregarding and undercounting, yeah. Framing, yeah, exactly. It even transitions here from the discussion about freaks. Framing dissidents as freaks is one option, but if that doesn't work, the next is to frame them as dangerous. So that's precisely what you're saying. That's exactly what their alternative is, right? Is like, and that's what they did with Occupy as well. Like when that narrative didn't catch, they started to emphasize every broken window, you know, every single damaged thing, every little piece of trash that was left in the park, right? And precisely that's what they would probably do with Cooperation Tulsa. If they were to transition to demonization, they would call us anarchists. And the thing is that, you know, there's a lot of anarchists in Cooperation Tulsa. That's not a lie, but they would do so with the purposeful desire to scare people because anarchism is a scary word that people don't understand.
Well, and there's power in that, and so I think, you know, I'm torn about whether demonization is necessarily a bad thing or whether it could be strategic. Because I do think that getting people to move from the status quo frequently requires there to be a scarier alternative to the potential change.
Right. Yes. Somebody here in chat says the text goes on to rank good representation as better than bad representation, and bad representation as better than no representation. One group needs to basically bite the bullet and be the villain. Which I don't know if that's Cooperation Tulsa's role in this whole thing, but yeah, there's a lot of truth to that insofar as looking at basically every successful movement. There's just always some part that's like the good representation. There's some part where it's like these are the bad guys, and kind of like you're saying, like there's some value in that, like in the Malcolm X as opposed to the MLK approach. And yeah, no, I think it's just part of about developing an ecosystem in that sense, right? But another person brought up a good question. In the last couple decades, which movements have been most effective in controlling the narrative? For my own sake, I think it's BLM. I think that BLM 2 did the best job controlling the narrative. What do other people think? Which movement do y'all think was the most effective in controlling the narrative in the last few decades? What do you think?
Wasn't Extinction Rebellion pretty good for a while until they were like really intensely repressed?
I do think there was I think they were generally seen as they had good control over their press for a while, and then there were all of the they splashed paint all over the paintings in the museums, and I think that led to them getting a lot of bad press. but they wanted that. They wanted that was conscious. It wasn't as if that were an accident, right? They did that on purpose. So that might actually count as being good control of their press. I mean, actually, I feel like somebody mentioned it earlier. The pro-Palestinian protesters had this just exceptional media training. Maybe that's a great example, perhaps.
The lesbians have done pretty good.
In what sense are you referring there about the lesbians writ large? Sorry, that just sounded funny. The lesbians are doing great. Everybody loves lesbians.
Well, they've done pretty well for themselves. I mean, no, but I mean, let's see. Trying to remember what they call themselves. I can't ever remember like their names of their groups, but I can't really think of anything else. But like lesbian protesters, and like dicks on their heads and huge pussies and like just, you know, like
the pussy hat protesters, as we sometimes call them.
The pussy hat protesters, but also like way before that, can't remember specifics at all, but
Chris pointed out that a negative example would be anti-mask and anti-vax groups were highly effective. I think that's very true for the worse for everybody, but agreed. These are all good examples. The truth is I think that there's a lot of narrative control in our movements these days. You know, there's a lot of good examples of narrative control now that I think about it. You know, I said BLM too, but I actually think that there's a lot of good examples. I also want to note, however, we only have 7 minutes left. So I wonder if anybody, you know, like has like closing thoughts about the section that we just read. Like, was there anything that kind of like, you know, like, well, what are your feelings about the section that we just read?
I'm just really curious how we can avoid falling victim to these evil little story spinners, fighters.
My personal opinion is that you can't. What you do is you just learn to weather it, right? Like you can't ever stop them from spreading false stories and propaganda and misinformation. And I mean that on an individual level as well. Like people are just going to talk shit ultimately, you know, but I think the key is that you have to have the wherewithal to continue striving forward and presenting the counter narrative, even when they tried to do so. So I really think about the civil rights movement, where there was really an enormous concerted effort to spread misinformation about the civil rights movement and about all of its founders and to distort the narrative. But one thing that they were really so good at was constantly reorienting the narrative towards their perspective and appealing to people's empathy and better nature. And ultimately it wasn't perfect because they still had really kind of low approval during their era, but it did ultimately succeed. And I think that is something we should keep in mind, is that, you know, we look back at the civil rights era and we're like, oh, everybody was on their side. They did such a good job. No, if you look at the polls, the polling was not on their side. They were not a majority. The majority did not agree with MLK or the civil rights movement writ large at almost any stage during the civil rights movement. They were unpopular even. But they were so good at constantly reorienting the narrative back to a sort of moral argument that they kind of persisted through that misinformation.
I think one of the things that leaps out to me is the challenge around sustaining a public narrative over an extended period of time. With the changes in media, it seems really hard to get things to penetrate and stay in focus. I really thought that with the murder of Alex Preddy, particularly on the heels of the murder of Good, that was going to be a turning point. But people have really effectively moved on from that place. And so it's like, how do you, because I thought that was going to be like a Bull Connor moment when the country was like, woof, we've got to change this. But they moved on.
I think that we did a bad job maintaining like narrative control. Like the left did not do a good job maintaining the narrative control after all of that. We got very distracted. The enemy succeeded in giving us 1,000 distractions, and we sort of took the bait in a very real sense. I think that it was very unhelpful. A lot of people on the left like spread a bunch of undermining narratives. Like one I saw a lot, there was numerous people on the left who kept being like, oh, you care when a white man gets killed by ICE, but you don't care when, you know, all of these immigrants are put in ICE facilities. And it's like, yeah, okay, maybe that is like a true statement about an inconsistent moral standard on the left, but it's not helpful when we're trying to push every advantage, right? Like we should be trying to push this advantage. The fact people do empathize with Alex Preddy should be a strength in our narrative construction, but instead a lot of people turned it into this finger wagging moment that really undermined a lot of people's passion for fighting for Renee Good and Alex Preddy. So we kind of shot ourselves in the foot with that a little bit. I'm not trying to blame that all on, you know, it's not the reason why that didn't succeed, but it's kind of an example of how sometimes we're not good at pushing our advantages when they're available.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I think it really is about how do we learn message discipline, because I think that's something that the right is very successful at, is that they build a narrative and then stick with it.
Yes. Yeah, they're very good at just like fucking parroting whatever the line is, you know. Yeah, we got a couple minutes left. Anybody else got any last thoughts? Just a reminder that since this is up and going again, we will be doing these every other Monday. So not next Monday, but the Monday after that, we will be continuing organizer education. We'll be doing the second session of Volume 2 of Full Spectrum Resistance. Just a reminder that if you are somebody who has just started listening, you can go find all of Volume 1 being read out loud either on the Anark YouTube channel or on the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube channel. All the live recordings are there, including our discussions afterwards, just like you heard there. I also want to emphasize that if you want to help Cooperation Tulsa succeed, please go over to our Open Collective and become a donor for any amount. Let me see if I can get it brought up, if I can remember the URL by heart. Oh, I got it. There we go. Yeah, I just want to encourage you to become a monthly donor. That is really the thing that helps us so enormously much. We rely on those monthly donors in order to like have an income stream so that we don't have to keep kind of like coming back over and over and over and asking for a new stream of income. This allows us to just kind of rely on that trickle of small donors. So I just want to emphasize, you know, please go over and become a donor at our Open Collective. You know, for any amount, just whatever you can pledge is enormously helpful. Yeah. So actually that puts us at 9 p.m. So I think we utilized our time well. Hopefully week after next, we'll be able to get started more properly exactly on time. I was kind of just getting everything back in the groove because of our hiatus. But yeah, no, I appreciate everybody coming to read, and I appreciate everybody coming in the live stream to listen to us have a discussion, also contributing useful questions. And also just to note that if you do become a donor on Open Collective, please reach out to us and we will give you a link to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord server. We would be happy to have you here in the discussion, reading. If you want to read, or if you just want to be part of the discussion group, whatever, just go over to the Open Collective, become a recurring donor for any amount. But yeah, that's about it. I appreciate everyone showing up, and I'll see you week after next.
Bye, guys.
See ya.
Take care.